After a year and a half on the air, Disney's Ducktales reboot has been a complete joy to watch. And along the way, it has sort of grown into itself. Where the first season was a little bit striking into a new path and trying to figure itself out, the second season hit the ground running. And we now have a version of DuckTales that is not only completely its own, but finally, after that year, feels more like DuckTales than it ever has before. And this is all proven with this week's episode, Storkules in Duckberg. When we first met the character Storkules in the DuckTales reboot, I kind of glossed over him. I was more interested in what was going on with Webby and Dewey, who were on an adventure trying to find the goddess Selene to figure out what happened to Della Duck. And I was so obsessed with that I might have failed to pay attention to one of the best parts of that episode. Now I have a chance to remedy that. In Storkules in Duckberg, Storkules obviously comes to Duckberg, but he's not just visiting, he's there to be Donald Duck's roommate. Slumber party! It's kind of a ridiculous idea for an episode, but it's also delightful, because not only is it just more time with Storkules, a character who is genuinely delightful and fun to watch, but it's the perfect scenario to get the most out of Donald. Donald Duck is a lovable character in his own right, but if we're honest, Donald at his best is Donald miserable. Donald being tortured. In other words, Donald Duck is the most fun to watch when he lives up to the final line of his own theme song. Who gets stuck with all the bad luck? No one but Donald Duck. And that's true in old cartoons when he's trying to run an apple orchard and he's being foiled by Chip and Dale. Similarly, that works so well here when he's just trying to rent out the spare room of his houseboat, but he's being foiled by having that room rented by Storkules, someone who loves him, who he doesn't quite love back. This puts this episode in the perfect position to get some of that classic Donald action. Donald Duck on edge as he's got a roommate who's bothering him. Donald Duck suspicious of someone not following his rules. Donald Duck ready at any moment to put up his fisticuffs and do the Donald dance. Anytime. And that's the best and most fun Donald to watch. But the whole episode isn't really about Donald. It's about putting Storkules in a position that we can use him to pick up on a thread brought into a previous episode. The creation and running of Louie Inc. If you remember from the season 1 premiere, Louie was worried about finding out where he fit in this adventuring group, and eventually decided that he was the person who could see the patterns in things, see fresh new angles, and find ways to make things work. He was essentially the businessman, which is the aspect of Scrooge he always wants to be the most like. At the end of that episode, he set up Louie Inc. This is the first time we see it in action, with the episode opening with him pitching Louie Inc. to Scrooge McDuck, hoping Uncle Scrooge will become his first investor. It doesn't work out that well.
All right, lad. How much do you need?
2.5 billion, please.
Louie may have learned that he's able to see different angles, but he hasn't quite figured out how to apply those skills yet. In the beginning of this episode, Scrooge comes in to help him out and explains the point of a business is to find a problem and offer a solution. The ideal business is helping people while making a tidy profit. And Louie doesn't know how to do that at first, but fortunately for him, Donald's new roommate provides a solution. It turns out that a flock of harpies from Greece have followed Storkules to Duckberg, and they're wreaking havoc on the town. Louie's solution is simple. Louie creates the Ghostbusters. Sort of. Louie actually creates a business called Harp Be Gone, and he hires Storkules as the manpower to help him capture the harpies that were released into Duckberg and contain them in Donald's houseboat. I couldn't help but to see the classic 1980s comedy movie in this episode. Louie is kind of like Bill Murray, helping to run this business to eliminate something that's threatening or bothering a city. And like Bill Murray, at the end of every single time they eliminate one of these threats, be it capturing a harpy or a ghost, he shows up with an exorbitant bill, making money hand over fist and helping the city at the same time, just like Uncle Scrooge said to. Even the storytelling kind of matches Ghostbusters beat for beat. The figuring out of what the solution is they can provide, setting up and running the business, the spinning headlines and the montage of the success of that business building up and up, and even the storage of all the caught creatures being compromised and released by someone who isn't paying attention to warnings or understanding, causing a new, different problem that only existed because they were re-released. Ultimately though, the plot of this episode isn't really that important. It's a lot of fun to see Louis learn about his limitations as a business manager and what he could be doing better. And it's also fun to see Storkules try and navigate the adult life of living as a normal mortal, as he's interested in doing. And it's also fun to see Donald learn that he maybe needs to be a little bit nicer to Storkules. But all those are just elements of a larger whole. The real reason I like this episode is something about it just feels like it's hit its stride. And I think the best examples of this are two characters that we usually don't see that much growth out of. Webby Vanderquack and Scrooge McDuck himself. Neither of them play a huge or mainstay role in this episode, but the roles they do play just feel extremely on point to me. Throughout this second season, and especially in the beginning of this episode, we're seeing a Scrooge McDuck that feels really comfortable with his family, who is now finally in this patriarchal position to be passing down advice calmly. He's not going on adventures or necessarily being bitter, but we see him being the Scrooge that I knew as a kid, giving wisdom to Louis, teaching him a life lesson about how a business works. It's somehow comforting and familiar to have seen this new version of Scrooge reach this place. It feels like this is a closer take to the Scrooge that was in the original Ducktales. Not that I've had any problem with the newer version of Scrooge, but it's nice to see those two versions of the character converge. In a really similar way, this version of Webbigail Vanderquack might be the closest we've seen to the 1987 Webby in the entire reboot so far. That is to say, she's being treated a little bit less as an equal. In the original series, Webby was always there and filled this role of a sister, but she was always like a nuisance sister. New Webby's always there at the front of the lines, just as out there as the boys. And this Webby in this episode still has all the new character traits and the confidence that we know Reboot Webby to have, but for the first time ever, she's kind of being ignored by the boys. She has this idea on how to solve the problem, a better idea than Louie has, and she keeps trying to tell Huey and Louie, but they're dismissing her and forgetting about her, and just sort of pushing her off. And that's something that would have happened to the original Webby, because she was just a girl. New Webby doesn't put up with that, however. When the climax of the episode happens, and someone else finally realizes that their original solution isn't working, and that there's a better way, that someone being Louis specifically, tries to kind of take credit for it. He comes up with this idea seemingly on his own to solve the solution. The whole thing feels a lot of how the boys treated the original Webby as a nuisance, but where the original Webbigail Vanderquack would have just whined that she wasn't being listened to or included, the new Webby takes a bit more of a direct approach. Normally I wouldn't endorse violence between family and surrogate siblings, but this really sells how she feels extremely well. And somehow, seeing this punch and this scene linked these characters together to me in a way that they hadn't before. Just like with Scrooge and his wisdom. And I think that's why I really like this episode. I love Storkules and his whole entire shtick, and the voice actor behind him, Chris Diamantopoulos, I hope I pronounced that right, is an amazing performer. I love him as Mickey Mouse. I love him as Storkules, and I think he adds so much to every role he's in. He was a delight to watch. Donald's reaction and Donald being a foil like he was in the old cartoons was a delight to watch. But this episode, instead, that's not my favorite part. My favorite part is how this is such a great example of how DuckTales 2017 has really found its stride. This is now a DuckTales that feels not only like its own unique DuckTales, but to me, very much in line with what the original series was as well. These are no longer just DuckTales characters in name and appearance, but I think very much in spirit as well. And although I always thought they were sort of, just a fair interpretation, they feel a bit more connected now to me. Just because of this through line in Scrooge's wisdom, or Webby's being sort of ostracized and being treated as a nuisance, and dealing with it in a new way. To me, we're seeing the two versions of these characters merge together. And I think that's really interesting, because not only is this episode good as an original, new reboot episode, but it fills in that structure of how there were so many episodes in the original Ducktales show where they just stayed at home in Duckberg and had an adventure in Duckberg that seemed big and grand and supernatural. And this is definitely that kind of adventure. And so although this episode doesn't really touch on the larger storyline involving the kids and Donald and Della, it is a really fun, good episode. To the end that it might be one of my favorite standalone DuckTales episodes so far. And the best part is, it's not even really that standalone, because it ties back to Storkules, and Louie is wearing what I'm pretty sure is his suit from the Gladstone episode, and there's all these little things tying it back. This is just a really good touchstone for how well-rounded and well-written this series has become. And we're only partway through season 2, so I just can't wait to see what the series does in the future.